First thing I'm going to do is set my alarm for 10 minutes so I don't speak forever, because I have a bad habit of blathering on. So when you hear this, when you hear the duck quack, don't be worried. There's no duck flying around. It's just this phone. Yeah, I'll limit it to 10 minutes, but there's a handout which you'll have in your seat, and there's a little essay in there about my exhibition that I've written, so maybe you can pick that up. And please do, if you've not had a good chance to look at the work on the walls, the exhibition runs to the end of this month, so I'm just going to see if... Is this working? Yeah. Make any difference? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to talk about the residency that started the process of me making this exhibition. So I graduated from art school quite late on in life. It was 2014, and the year after that, you might remember, there was a lot of coverage in the media of the so-called migration crisis, people trying to come across the Mediterranean, and all kinds of tragic stories coming out of that. And I was really motivated to try and make some work about migration in response to that. My first thought was to look at Scottish history, and I spent a couple of years travelling around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland, making aerial pictures of abandoned settlements in the Highlands and Islands. Yeah? And after participating in some group shows and showing that work, I actually got to thinking, hang on a minute, if I think of the names of my grandparents, it's McElhinney, Durkin, Gallagher and Brannan, so all roads lead back to Ireland. My maternal grandfather actually grew up in Mayo. My great-grandparents on my father's side are from, both were born literally during the Irish famine. One was born in 1850, one was born in 1851. They married in 1871, and they came to Glasgow after that. So that's how my interest was sparked in applying for a residency. That was an exchange where someone would go... Sorry? Hello. Okay, that probably makes a difference to the guys recording it. So back in 2019, I applied for a residency exchange where one person from Glasgow would go over to spend a month in Donegal at ArtLink in a place called Fort Dunree, and then later on someone would come back in return. So while I was over there, I didn't at that time have a clear idea of what my project would be. I was just spending a lot of time travelling around Donegal, having a great time, to be honest, dragging Martha up mountains and the mist and all sorts. But I kind of hit upon various things while I was there. So there was a particular place called Inch Levels where every winter thousands and thousands of geese and also hooper swans would come and roost and overwinter. And I was thinking about the fact that these swans, and there's thousands of them there on the wall, they were migratory birds. They would come from Iceland and spend their winters in Donegal, and that got me thinking about the connections to what I was already interested in, the migration of people. Another thing that happened was that I had a second cousin who is into genealogy, and once he knew that I was going to spend this time in Donegal, he helped me do some research in the family history, and he plotted or managed to identify the exact field in Donegal where our family had come from. And so I went and I stood in the field. You know, there was a rainbow, but no leprechaun, no pot of gold, but there was a rainbow, unbelievably, on the day that I showed up in this field. And alongside this nice big house built on the edge of the field, there was this little dishevelled farmhouse with a big crack in the wall, and that was the very place where my family had come from. So these little things started to build into questions about, where we'd come from, how we got here. But also, another thing that happened while I was there in the residency is Martha told me about this talk that was being given by someone at the local Maritime History Museum, and they were going to be talking about migratory patterns and the ships that journeyed to various places. And I went there and listened to this talk, and they spoke about this ship called the Exmouth that left Derry in 1847 to sail for Canada. And there was nearly 300 people on board. They were almost all women and children going to join their male relatives in Canada. They'd gone ahead to find work, and they were no sooner out in the Atlantic. There was a massive storm. They were blown backwards, and they thought they saw the lights of Tory Island off Donegal, but as it turned out, in fact, it was actually the south end of the island of Islay, the Scottish island of Islay, and the ship was wrecked on the Rins of Islay. And I went there and later on to that spot and saw the memorial and everything, because basically everybody was killed except for a few of the crew that were thrown off onto the rocks. So that kind of, I suppose, crystallised where I would go next with the project after I returned, and that was to sort of, I was just asking myself the question, how come so many people ended up in Glasgow? And obviously it's connected to the famine that happened, right? And I then read a lot on the history of the famine and its causes. And, and I should say my first degree when I was young was in history, so I was kind of deep into the research side of it as well. Now, after a break because of COVID, when I couldn't travel, I then went back last year twice to Ireland, and this time what I did was I travelled from the very north of Ireland to the very south and stuck to the coast. There's this kind of route called the Wild Atlantic Way that I just basically travelled along for weeks on end on two separate occasions, and just photographed the landscape mostly as I went, and that spawned a lot of the works that you see now in the exhibitions. There is other stuff that's partly from Scotland, so there's photographs that you might recognise of Ailsa Craig, which is known as Paddy's Milestone. It's a kind of volcanic plug that comes out of the Clyde estuary, and it's literally halfway between Glasgow and Belfast. So all these connections started to come into the work. But I suppose the biggest set of images that you see through in that other room, it's called Old Country, and it's just all those pictures of the journeys that I made in Ireland. And it's kind of an abstract way of picturing a concept of the old country. This is about Ireland, but there are so many migrants who come to this country from different points of origin, and we all have a conception of that place that we or our families might have come from. And when I was young and growing up, I never went to Ireland. There was 5 kids. My mum and dad didn't drive. The furthest west we went was Rossi. That's a fact. Still go to Rossi. My ideas about what Ireland was as a country was all stories told to me by my parents, because they'd visited many times growing up. So what you see when you look at that wall called Old Country, all these pictures, is a kind of a weird amalgam of, I kind of think in hindsight that the images that I made, the subject matter I was drawn to, is in part because of this kind of stories that had been told in my head. So it might actually be a distorted view of Ireland and the west of Ireland, but it's my view based on the things that I'd learned growing up, and it all led to this exhibition. Just wondering how long I've got. 33 seconds. I'm doing pretty good, but I do know that before the duck quacks I've got to kind of wind up. So I'll wind up by saying there was 2 questions that I carried with me while I was making the work. and they're probably still with me because they can never be fully answered, and they were, how come it took me until I was like in my mid-50s before I actually reflected on the fact that my ancestry is Irish? I think there's a lot behind that that you could unpack. And it's related perhaps also, there's a duck, right on cue, but it's also related to the fact of the second question, why was I never taught about the Irish famine when I was at school? So both my boys, they're in that picture up there, that's my sons, they're both at university in Glasgow now, and they're both studying history. So I've gone through the whole of their school years, gone through their subject matter with them, and they'll get taught a bit, bits about British imperialism, bits about the transatlantic slave trade, loads about World War II, because of course that was, we won that one, that was uncontestable, but nothing really except in passing about Irish history, about, here we are, centenary of Irish gaining independence for the 26 states. It's never taught in the schools in Scotland, and yet there's a really high percentage of people in the west of Scotland in particular who do have Irish ancestry. So that's part of the motivation behind making the work, is to kind of open up that dialogue. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. And I'm afraid, I'm not sure I'll be as good as Frank about keeping to my time, but I'll do my best. My name's Maureen McIver, and I'm an artist based mainly in Northern Ireland, but was born in Scotland and have strong links. All my family really are split between some living in Scotland and some in Donegal, and a long history of travelling and spending time between Scotland and Donegal. So I would have spent a lot of time travelling on the ferry back and forward to Donegal. So I've been working as an artist for since the 1980s, and really it's always been a part of my practice, a part of my interest was my sort of sense of identity in relation to the sort of Scots-Irish history. So my father was from Maryhill in Glasgow, I should say, and my mother is really from Gweedore in Donegal. I just wanted to start with this quotation from John Berger and Jean Moore's book, A Seventh Man, which was a book about the migration of men from rural Eastern Europe for work during the 1970s. I won't read it out. I think if people can see it, well, maybe I should. A friend came to see me in a dream from far away, and I asked in the dream, "Did you come by photograph or train?" All photographs are a form of transport, an expression of absence. And I really just love this quotation. I think that sense of the photograph as being in itself a form of transportation that takes us through to connecting with our with memory, imagination, and a sense of time. So I'm going to take you through actually quite a lot of things that are to do with previous work that I've made, because I feel in a way I have to sort of introduce myself through some of this work that I've made previously. So if you could just sort of bear with me. So in 2014 I was awarded a residency, an artist residency to go to the Tyrone Guthrie Centre in Annaghmakerrig in County Monaghan. And I wanted during the residency to develop my interests and skills with the wet plate collodion photography process, which is a historical photographic process, and which involves sort of coating glass plates or tin plates with a light-sensitive collodion and then exposing them. So it would have been sort of one of the very early forms of photography, developed in about the 1850s. So this was a wet plate photograph that I'd made myself of the Tyrone Guthrie house that I'd made during the residency, and I was using a sort of large format camera as well. And This image of the house, which was the Tyrone Guthrie residence, and was the residence that the house that we were all staying in, sort of is part of the sort of legacy of, in a way, Ireland's colonial past, and these biggest country estates, and these what would have been regarded as, or would have been called, the big houses. So I was interested in me taking this photograph in 2014 of a building which begins to look like, the image of it might have been taken at the time when the house was built in the 1900s, and it would have been a new building at the time. In order to sort of make my images, wet plate photography requires very quick sort of exposure and processing time. So I had to make, I wanted to work out in the field and around about the estate, the Tyrone Guthrie estate. So I made my own little portable darkroom where I would coat my plates and expose the film, and then I would develop them in this little box. They would be known, these boxes, as dark boxes. And I became quite interested in the idea of the dark box. I was looking at the time of the work by Lady Hawarden, who was actually from Cumbernauld originally, but she married a wealthy landowner, Viscount Hawarden, in 1845. And she's very well known. She's got a collection in the Victoria and Albert Museum of her photographs of her daughters, where she would have photographed them in South Kensington in London, in their home there. But she also spent considerable amount of time photographing in their estate in County Tipperary in Ireland, Dundrum estate. And she would produce, most of her image, she would include a figure and often her daughters. Justin Carville, in his book Photography in Ireland, writes about how Lady Clementina's images have a sense of isolation and introspection. These photographs were taken, as I say, about 1858 to 1861. So at that time, that was really in County Tipperary would have been the sort of just about the same at the time of the famine or just post-famine, and there would have been huge, there would be incredible poverty. People would be living in very difficult situations. So he writes about the fact that, in a way, that she used the forest as almost like a screen to cut off herself from this the horrors of what would have been outside of her estate. So I made some of my own images at the time with these ideas in mind, and I brought clothing, and I like this idea of the white dress and echoing the notion of the white dress in the landscape, so I'd made these as wet plate collodion images. And the dress has that sense of foreboding, I think, and its fragility within this sort of landscape. This is another one of Lady Hawarden's prints, and of the Multeen River in Dundrum. You probably can barely see it, but to the right of the image is her dark box that she would have used to process her plates. And I found that quite interesting, this idea of this dark box in the landscape, because in a sort of a way it became almost like this sort of black, shadowy sort of shape. I'll show you in the next image. I think you'll probably be able to see it maybe a little bit better. So this is my own photograph, wet plate collodion photograph, looking down to the lake in the estate, and just beside the big tree there down below you can see there is my dark box where I was processing my films. And again, it was interesting, this idea of like the dark box almost being shrouded in this black material and almost being like a sort of quite a sort of negative and sort of shape within the landscape. So this sort of strange quality to it. This is a tin of photographs that belonged to my grandmother, Mary McGee, and I have worked a lot over the years with family photographs, and I'm really interested in the richness of these sort of memories that we have, and these sort of through these images. This tin would have been kept in a cupboard in my grandmother's kitchen, and I hadn't seen it for many years, but it was passed on to my mother, who's the eldest of 11 children. I had an exhibition in the Linen Hall Library in Belfast in 2018, and with two other artists who were exploring themes about migration between Ireland and the UK. And I started to take digital scans of some of these photographs, some family photographs and documents. Quite a lot of them came from my grandmother's tin of photographs. So I've got some sort of close-ups of some of these images. It's worked as a triptych. So I had an image that was a digital scan, scanned on a flatbed scanner, of a photograph that is of my grandfather, which was taken in Jerome Studios in Glasgow. It was a very popular, the Jerome Studios at the time, and there were shops all over the UK where people could go to get their photograph taken, and often they would be dressed up in their Sunday best, and they would go to get their image, a photograph taken, which they would send back to their relatives in Ireland. So I was interested in just the process of scanning the image and the wallet. Sorry, there's a little wallet, as you can see there, which the photograph's inside, and the sort of shape of the frame, and the idea of the ellipse as a pattern within a number of these images. So I like this idea of like the sense of the orbits, of planetary orbits, and so I digitally manipulated a little sort of drawing into the right hand image, which was sort of conveying the sense of planets and the idea of orbits, and was interested in how this notion of cyclical patterns of migration, because my family and my grandfather would have come across to Scotland when he really during the summertime, so there would be a lot of sort of seasonal work, and he would have come across because it was very difficult to have enough of a living for his family, a large family, and it was very common at the time that people would come back and forward. So this is a passport photograph of my mother and Ellen McGee, and 1945, and she would be leaving from Derry to go to work at Glasgow. And again, I scanned the image, and I really like the sense of that it became more than a photograph, that it becomes an object, and the scanner shows up as very object qualities in the passport photograph. So again, there's the pattern of the ellipse within it as well. And then the third one in the triptych is a photograph on the left of my grandmother with her friend, and the image there on the right hand screen is of an eye test that she would have taken, which was another sort of document inside the tin. And this idea again of these echoes of this elliptical shape, and ideas of the sense of our sense of identity is shaped through sort of personal experiences, and also institutional sort of influences through the different sort of experiences we have, and obviously very common to people who are in the process of moving between countries. This is a piece of work that I made for a project which was organised by ArtLink and the Nerve Centre in Derry in 2020. And it was called Drawn from Borders. It was bringing together a group of artists to work on a project about the experience of living with with the Irish border, and it was very pertinent at the time because just post-Brexit, and it really sort of we went through a very interesting series of discussions and workshops to produce work to do with this idea of the border. So I again used the digital scanner to scan parts of a map, which is the Irish Border Commission map from 1925, which would have been the time of partition in Ireland, where the north is formed, and so the south of Ireland is demarcated by this red line that you can just see at the top left there of the image. So this is a fragment of that map. And it would have been the creation of the north and south of Ireland. So I was interested in this red line as a demarcation, as a historical mark, but also the idea of as people and the sense of us living within this situation, and is the red line and the red thread as almost like a sort of drawing in itself, and that it sort of, for me, it had the sense of being like a lifeline as well. So the cloth on the left-hand side is a red cloth, which would be known as Benin Jarrag, and it's a red flannel cloth, and my mother would have had this and used this to drape over her shoulders or whatever, because she would get a touch of arthritis, and it has these sort of healing properties. So I was interested in this idea of the sense of touch and the closeness of these sort of images. This is now moving into Glasgow and doing the residency, which started in 2021, which was a fantastic experience, having a month based in Govan Hill. And again, I was able to speak to a number of very interesting people about their experiences of migration within their family, and people also very kindly lent me photographs that I could scan, and this is a photograph of a box of photos from Catherine Callaghan, belonging to her mother Mary and father John. This is just an image of a digital photograph that I took of one of the ladies that I spoke to, Maureen Stewart, who told me a lot again about her family and her sense of migrating, how her mother migrated to Glasgow when she was very young, and her mother was quite ill, so Maureen had to spend a lot of time with her grandmother in Donegal. But it was really interesting to have the opportunity to speak to people, and quite interesting that in a sense what the people I spoke to mainly would be sons and daughters of the people who maybe originally migrated and settled in Glasgow. This is another image of the hands of Teresa McCluskey, who had a really rich, interesting story. She comes from Gartan in County Donegal, and spoke to me about her family's experience of having to flee from Ireland to Scotland because to escape some religious sectarianism at the time. So I'm hoping that when I have my exhibition here in Straight Level, that I'll be reflecting on these experiences. And what I suppose I started to gather from what I was when I was speaking to people is just almost how overwhelming these connections are between Donegal and Glasgow, and how many people have stories which are overlapping. And so I sort of became interested in this idea of collective memory. So see, here are a series of photographs that were from one of the collections I looked at of people who are meeting up in Queen's Park in Govan Hill, probably during the 1940s and 50s. They're little box brownie images, and this area, or this particular part of the park, I think became known as Donegal Hill, because so many young Irish people would have gathered there, or sort of socialised and got together probably in between work, and so there was quite a number of these images of people sort of sitting on the bank of the hill at the time. They would have been the selfie images, I'm sure, of their day. So I went out, and it became quite interesting, this idea of particular locations in Glasgow and in Donegal that had this connection with the idea of collective memory. So I spent quite a lot of time going back and forward to places during the residency, and then more recently, I sort of decided to decide on what approach I was going to take in terms of having to filter all this information and decide how to make my work about it. So I began to think about taking these some of the tiny little images and getting them printed onto cloth and material. Because I think I was interested quite in the idea of the backdrop and the photographic backdrop. So I took this as would have been a tiny 3x2 sort of box brownie image, and it's been enlarged, as you can see, into quite a big piece. And then I brought it back to the location where I think it would originally have been taken with it's an image of my mother with a group of friends, obviously, sitting out in the grass in Queen's Park. And I took all of these, this new set of images I've been using 5x4 large format camera, because again I'm interested in the different formats of photography and how that conveys a particular quality to the image and a sense of integrating things within the image. So this is a photograph I had taken when I was just quite early on producing these large cloth pieces, and I sort of was playing with this idea of where to put these pieces, and I like this idea of them being connected with domestic routines like washing clothing, or and probably connected a lot to some of these sort of female experiences, I suppose, and rituals, domestic rituals that are passed down. I also quite like the idea of like my mother looking back at me. This is an image of her. It was me doing the washing. So this is looking down towards what would be the Paddy's Market area, and in Glasgow. And it'd been many years since I'd actually visited these places, but I'd actually, as a child, been taken to Paddy's Market quite a lot, and my mother was always really excited and interested in it as a place, and I thought it's had such a strong sense of memory for so many Irish people. These are photographs that I took myself back in the 1980s when Paddy's Market was still thriving at the time, and I like this idea of taking things from a similar viewpoint and looking down just from this same sort of position. So these would be taken with 35mm film, and you can see obviously the change in the location, and Harry's snack bar is gone, and the sort of different has changed considerably. So this, again, a bit of close-ups of images that I took at the time, and the idea of like Paddy's Market and its history within Glasgow and in other cities was again part of the experience of Irish migrants who dated really back to the 1850s, and the idea of trying to sort of use things like second-hand clothing and cloth and the sale of cloth as a means to make a living. Closed in 2009, Paddy's Market. So I went back again then recently and took my own photograph again with the 5x4 camera, and I placed my own little bit of Donegal into the image. So the image of Errigal is so well known and is such a memorable sort of image throughout Donegal. You'll see it everywhere. And people always photograph it. So I photographed it and then brought it across and put it on the closed doorway and re-photographed the scene. But I'm sort of interested in that idea of going back to these locations, and I've been doing it in Donegal as well, and trying to recreate this sense of the quality of the photographs that would have been taken at that point in time, and this sort of connection with the sort of our sense of time and place within this sort of experience.
Right, this picture looks like an odd place to start. ignore the pictures for a minute. I'm just going to read something, a kind of wee potted kind of history of ArtLink, and kind of me going to Donegal. So if you don't mind, I'll just read it. We could be anywhere, but we choose here, on the edge, in the wind and the wild, and the heathery hills and the damp, away from the centre, away from train stations. We do have a bus that comes once a day, and an electric bicycle, and drivers willing to offer you a lift. The space we occupy at Fort Dunree is modest. It's a multi-function room in a former military hospital, where unannounced visitors are welcomed, meetings are held, funding applications are sweated over, and art and tea are made, and where the internet is what we euphemistically call intermittent. We do, however, have access to an elegant gallery, a rich history, and inspirational vistas over land and sea, which are unique to this beautiful remote site. So Fort Dunree is the best preserved of 6 forts built by the British on Loch Swilly when fears of a French invasion were high. The original fort was built in 1813 and houses a military museum, while the surrounding headland is littered with World War I remains, gradually melting into the heather-covered hillside. Loch Swilly, one of Ireland's great natural harbours, may seem like a backwater now, but it has played its part in significant historical events, from the Viking invasions and the flight of the Earls to the 1798 Rising and World War I. And everybody will have heard of Wolfe Tone, obviously a major figure in all that, who was captured just down the road from the fort. ArtLink was celebrating 10 years of success shortly after I arrived in Buncrana in 2000 actually, one of a host of people moving home, as they say, around that time. People came in waves from Glasgow, so around 2000 there was a big wave. Around kind of late 70s there was a previous wave. It's just your mum and dad moved back around the same time as I moved over. Yep. So yeah, it happens all the time. It's like, as Frank says, it's not something that happened in the 19th century. There's always periods of hardship or periods when lots of people leave, when like whole like swathes of young people leave. Like at the minute, they all seem to be in Australia. So I wasn't raised here, but my mother is raised there. But my mother was from the area, and these roots give me license to call it home. So I'm not exactly a blow-in, as they call it. I was drawn here to be with my family, or to Donegal to be with my family, to pursue my art practice, to step out of academia, because I'd spent a long time teaching at the art school after I was working at street level, and I wanted to get space and make my own work. Didn't quite work out that way, but setting up a photography business is not a good route to making your own artwork. Anyway, I did do some, and I like to think that the social photography that we did was art as well, actually, was like art for people. Yeah, that's what I like to think. But ArtLink was also the draw, because I knew about ArtLink before I moved. I couldn't have imagined moving from Glasgow to a wee town like Buncrana without the possibility of becoming part of a community of artists. At this point, ArtLink had substantial resources and was based in a restored 19th century corn mill in the edge of Buncrana, and was held together by 3 founding artists, Lisa Spillane-Doherty, Marie Barrett and Aileen Barr. Now Marie Barrett is another artist whose family were from Glasgow, and they actually moved over around the same time as my mum moved over in about 79, 78, something like that. There was loads of people moved back then. The organisation but soon reached a turning point, so by 2003 the founding artists had moved on and the management structure changed. Vary Sutherland, that some people might know, who was again somebody that's gone back and forward from Ireland to Scotland. She's living in Ireland again, so she ended up being the creative director, and she initiated the connection with Fort Dunree and established a satellite exhibition space where pilot projects such as an edge centering and international residency took place in 2007. The origins of edge centering began in 2006 when representatives from Norway and East Iceland visited Donegal to locate a West European partner for their Gulf Stream project. which used the Gulf Stream as an actual and metaphorical link between the regions of Norway, East Iceland and North West Ireland. This was the basis of the partnership, which each year we still welcome artists from Norway or Iceland to take part in our residency programme. And then we recently extended this to this North Atlantic connection to Newfoundland, our closest neighbour across the ocean. And that connection also comes about because of another thing about Donegal is it's kind of famous for its shipwrecks, and the whole northwest of Ireland famous for shipwrecks, and one of them was the sinking of the Laurentic in the First World War, and a lot of Newfoundland men perished in that sinking. Men that were only just going home, they weren't even, and they were going home on leave, going to see their families when they died. So that created that connection as well, and there's obviously cultural connections in Newfoundland and Ireland. So 2 more directors followed after Vary, and then in 2013 the Arts Council decided to withdraw the funding during the recession, and so we relocated to Fort Dunree completely. We had little resources, but we were determined to keep things going, and we changed in the process, I think, in some ways for the better. So ArtLink has in some ways returned to its roots. It's once again non-hierarchical in its staff structure. It's basically Team ArtLink runs the thing. We do have a board, but it's quite, they kind of let us get on with it. We've now got a membership, financial support from the Arts Council and the County Council, and a commitment to caring for and sustaining local artists and celebrating what's unique about the place. Nobody could have foreseen the circumstances of the past few years, almost unimaginable changes in the daily patterns of life, suddenly working remotely. A concept once seen as aspirational, which became enforced reality for many. As it turned out, for ArtLink, the concept of isolation and remoteness was perhaps less strange. Operating and collaborating at a distance had long been an element in our working methods. Despite the shortcomings of infrastructure, temperamental Wi-Fi and occasional power outages, we were able to meet regularly with other organisations, albeit virtually, developing much stronger connections than before. Internationally, we were able to host events with artists from anywhere on the planet, attended by an international audience. Michael Flaherty, for instance, sounds like the guy that runs the pub in the main street. And yes, there is a pub called Flaherty's in the main street, but he's actually from Port Union in Newfoundland, and invents devices that slow processes down and make them visible. He was our first resident from Newfoundland as an artist, and as part of our newly established partnership with Eastern Edge Gallery, which is a brilliant space, great community of artists in St John's. He started his residency by inviting us to visit him virtually in his studio, and eventually managed to travel to Donegal to make a tidal weaving device. Now maybe I'll go into the slides and stop rabbiting on. So this image here is an image from Agnès Tondeur, a French artist's residency. She came here and showed us the magic of the wind and the weather. She's based in Paris, and she had all sorts of ideas of what she was going to do in Dunree, but she got taken over by, because when you're there, what's it like? You're just so aware of being within the elements. You're right on this rocky cliff face. So she started doing things, and there's loads and loads of blackberry bushes everywhere, loads of brambles. So she worked with brambles, making pigments, and showed us how to capture the waves. And this is just, I'll try not to take too long because I realise I might be kind of running over time. So just made some beautiful experiments with us, and it's kind of maybe a bit reminiscent of some of things that Richard Long makes, but I just think that's just such a beautiful image. Using gum arabic to kind of set the kind of debris from the waves, and yeah, I quite like that one with the swimmers running in. We have this. There's another military fort near Buncrana that's kind of an abandoned fort, and it's a popular spot for swimmers. This is before people invented this thing they invented about 2 years ago called wild swimming or sea swimming. Yeah, the sea was there before. And then she was getting people to make these, make kind of bodily extensions to draw with the wind. And then she suspended pens and pencils and things from bushes and trees and wind bushes and created amazing, like, I like to think of these drawings as being almost like photographs because they're time-based things, and depending on the weather and depending on the duration, you get a different thing going on. Really beautiful work. That's just a device that this wee boy decided to make to draw with. It was lovely. It was like kind of magical. And we like, when we have artists in residence, we like to keep them. We like to keep them coming back. So Anais has been back a few times, and when she came back, one of the other things that developed from the residency was she started doing this thing with another artist called Yesenia Thibault, and they made a piece called the Storm Tamer Collection, which is a kind of growing collections of objects about ways that human beings, way back in time, right up to the present time, have tried to control the weather. And this collection was to do with the ways that they try to control the wind quite often. And when you live in a place that's by the sea, places like the north of Scotland and the north of Ireland and the west coast of Ireland are full of stories about, sometimes there's witches involved actually. There's objects and rituals around how to either raise the wind or tame the wind, because obviously it's a life and death situation when you spend a lot of your time dependent on the sea and dependent on being able to survive a storm. It was a beautiful thing. That's a kind of wide shot of this collection of hundreds of objects. Yeah. And then more recently, Anthony Haughey came and he did. He was artist in residence last year, and he did a project that culminated in a sort of an event at Fort Dunree. He invited people to be part of a flag raising ceremony to mark the centenary of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and he invited people to make their own flags, new flags for Ireland, and we had this. So that on the left there in the purple jumper is Rebecca. She's another member of Team ArtLink. She's kind of quite a vocal member, so I usually make her stand out front. I don't usually do this kind of thing. And Anthony Haughey's in the middle, and on the right is Sean Beattie, a local historian who's got a really good knowledge of Irish history. And so this is some of the kids that are raising their flags. It was a really amazing, beautiful event. Even though those two artists ended up doing exhibitions or doing events, we like to see the residency as just an excuse for people to come and play and experience the place and experiment, and maybe it might be 10 years down the line that they produce something. But we don't put people under pressure to actually do something at the time. So I just wanted to show a few images that show this place, as I say, this is shown in a beautiful sunny day. It is sunny sometimes. And the buildings are, that's the Laurentic Monument that we were involved in developing. I think it was put up 29. It was there when you were there, wasn't it? The end of 20. In fact, it was when you were there. It was unveiled. This is the view from my office. And now there's some sculptures there on that place there that would have been one of the lookout points. It's just a really amazing place, isn't it? It's very inspiring. Everybody that comes finds different things in it. It's kind of falling apart, as you can see. Every time there's a bit of a storm, like that building there when Frank was here, that still had a side on it. Yeah. We call this the village. Anyway, so we're there just now, and but it will gradually melt away, but it will still be fine even if it does, because it's kind of the nature's taken over, which is a kind of important part of the place as well. Oh yeah, I didn't finish what I was reading. Oh, I should. Hang on quickly. So yeah, and then so we had this artist from London that came, Matthew de Kerrison-Gerardo, and he basically made an animation from a face he saw in Malin Head, And Christine Mackey initiated a living herbarium that's now a thriving community garden, where last year the community garden people tried to grow oats to make a straw hat. And then, of course, Frank explored the length and breadth of Donegal, tracing connections, and showed us the beauty of those migratory swans. And so we kind of like to try and gather people to us. As I say, we want them to be migratory and not just come once and then disappear. That's the potting shed that Christine Mackey established, and that's still kind of, it's there as a place for people to inhabit and make their own projects. Yeah, so that's it.
Hi everyone. I'm a little bit daunted about doing this talk tonight because I am a blow-in. Martha was saying, I'm, as they would say in Ireland, I'm very new to the parish. I only came here about 2.5 years ago during the first lockdown. But what prompted me to get involved in this project of trying to write a short book about the Irish in Govan Hill and the Gorbals was two things. There was always these fragments of memories and things handed down in our family that my grandmother had been born in the Gorbals, but nobody knew where. But people didn't in those days. Something sort of came out later that people didn't talk too much about these things after they went back. You know, people from Donegal can be quite reserved in that way. And so, but during that first lockdown, I decided to go and try and research it, just using all the the usual things, trying to find censuses, birth certificates, and those sorts of things, and try and piece them all together, which became a fascinating thing between myself, and we have a little Facebook Messenger group between all our cousins and uncles, aunts, and stuff like that. And this really lit up, because everybody was going and finding old photographs that they had, or that maybe had been left to them, and so on, and sharing them. And even my father, who as they would say in Derry, my father's not a great man for the phone. He wouldn't really call you up that much. You have to phone him to get a chat. But he phoned up one night and was on the phone for 3 hours, just talking about everything that he could remember about what his grandmother had said, what he knew about her brothers and sisters, what happened to the family, trying to make all those connections. And what we found out was that the big story was that my great-grandmother ran a lodging house in the Gorbals, or was some sort of landlady or something like that. That's how they made their living during those times. Turns out that wasn't the case at all. My great-grandfather was a tramway plate layer. It was quite a skilled job on the trams. I'll show you a photograph of them here. How do I click that? So this is a photograph, a bit like the photographs that you were talking about, taken in a studio in Govan Hill, in the Gorbals in about 1900. That's my grandmother, on Kathleen Sweeney, and that's her parents, Charles Sweeney and Margaret Boyle, who came over in 1898. So that's it. And then when you go and find the census, actually, it wasn't just sort of running a lodging house or anything like that. The lodgers that were staying with them were all cousins and nephews and nieces that were come from Glasgow to work for the summer or work for a while. They were all related, and it really, those sorts of things really got me thinking about sort of patterns of migration. It was fascinating to begin to piece the story together a bit. But then the other thing that happened, the second thing that prompted it, was I ran into, not long after the sort of lockdown lifted and pubs began to open, in Heritage Bar in Govan Hill, I was introduced to a guy called Tony May Gallagher, who used to run the bus from what was known as Little Donegal to Glasgow. I think every week, every Friday, come back on the Sunday, and he was a lovely guy to get talking to. Of course, fascinating stories about sort of how people were constantly travelling back and forth. One of the first stories he told me about was when he was very young, about how he was hired out at a hiring fair to go and work for a farmer on Uí Island, just off Kincashla, where he grew up. He was only 8. He said he was only 9 or 10 or something like that. It was heartbroken, having to live in a shed, and it really got you thinking about, sort of that time, that hiring fairs and all those sorts of things existed well into the 20th century in Donegal. It was an indication of sort of how poor how poor that region was. And then, but very quickly, Donegal's a very tight area. Very quickly then we began to start making connections. Like my grandfather, when he qualified as a national school teacher, was sent to teach on Uí Island. And we began to piece together these things, and a cousin of mine that lived in Burton Port that he knew as well. And it was just, this has happened so often since I've been here. Just the other night I ran into another couple of people whose family are all from Gweedore. And once you get talking about it, people start sharing those stories, and it's absolutely incredible, and all that rich experience. And I think the thing that Tony May sadly died last year, I always had an intention to sort of sit down with him and record, an interview, or if I could, if he'd be willing to do it. And it got me thinking that we're in danger of losing a lot of this memory, especially in that generation. People have maybe moved on from the Gorbals and Govan Hill, sort of with all the redevelopment and all that's gone on. But I suppose the other thing that's motivating me about the book as well is to try and contribute to an understanding of migration, about being centred on human beings. I was involved in the Battle of Kenmure Street when we surrounded the deportation van. A really inspiring day to be, an emotional day to be involved in, and the chant of people saying, "These are our neighbours, let them go." And what that brought together in the community, and the solidarity and all that sort of stuff. And the people who decide government migration policy just can't understand why that happened. They just don't have a clue why that happened. Them and the press and so on seem to believe that they're constantly appealing to a backward prejudice and resentment towards migrants. And instead, the story of migration is of people living alongside each other. You think about Govan Hill and the Gorbals. Do you know what I mean? The Jewish and Lithuanian people who arrived there, along with the Irish and all that sort of stuff, and all lived together and all went through great tumultuous struggles as well. So I think it's also about trying to counter that idea, the dominant idea. I think the dominant narrative that I've certainly come across and been really pulled up sharply by sometimes since my time in Glasgow is that the dominant narrative is this idea of the Irish arriving here in the famine, poor, wretched victims of the famine, throwing themselves on the mercy and testing the patience of the, of the local population in Glasgow. And I think this really undermines the way in which, or really fails to understand the way in which the Irish shaped Glasgow, not only built Glasgow, but also shaped and were involved in all the incredible social movements that were, that have shaped this city. And it's about sort of wanting to go back and try as much as possible to sketch that history, tell a bit of the story of my own family in it, but as a means of encouraging other people to tell their stories as well, which is wonderful. Paula's here is involved in the Govan Hill Basque Community Trust, and as part of this we've set up an Irish storytelling group. There was such interest in it in the summer that we started that, and people are coming all the time and wanting to sort of bring their fathers and mothers along to tell their stories, and that's going to be recorded as part of the book. So it's trying to do that, Yeah, and I love, so the thing is that is understanding that this history is contested, not just about the Irish, but about every migrant group that comes here. And, I really, just doing the research of this, doing a bit of research to try and tell that story, I came across quite an incredible quotation from Reverend Duncan Cameron of Kilsyth, who was a member of the Church of Scotland Subcommittee on Irish Immigration. They were terribly panicked and worried about this and wanted to campaign well into the 20th century for people to be repatriated and so on. And he was speaking in 1922, just a couple of years after Red Clydeside in 1919, and he said, as a backhanded compliment, I think, he said, "Nearly all the leaders were Irish. In the course of time, instead of a Scottish proletariat, there would be a body of people who had no regard for the United Kingdom and who were prone to revolutionary ideas." And so that, that I think is an indication of, the involvement, sort of the Irish people were involved in the great rent strikes, all those sorts of things, Irish people were there all the time and right up to this day. I don't want to speak for very long, but the other thing is about trying to understand the history. Oh, sorry, I meant to put up this as well. I really love this map because when you start researching the history, it very, very quickly, as people like Frank said, it very, very quickly demolishes all the myths, sort of an outsider, foreigners turning up. This is a very interesting map. I loved it when I saw it, with Ireland and Scotland turning its side, and with all the Gaelic place names, the origins of the Gaelic place names, because the reason for this is that the west coast of Scotland was settled from the 400s onwards by a tribe called the Dalriada, who came from the northeast, around where Antrim is now. That's where they settled, bringing with them the Gaelic language. The west coast was settled by Picts. Do you know what I mean? Eventually, about the 1800s, it became a united kingdom. The Romans, who built Hadrian's Wall, knew the Dalriada as the Scoti. So the origins of Scotland comes from that, and the influence of the Gaelic language after the arrival of St. Columcille from Derry and Iona, and the spread of Christianity, which is bound up with the Gaelic language. All of this is part of the formation of Scotland, and it's any time you go back, that the whole bedrock of human civilization is the movement of people and their influence and the cross influence of it. But going back and looking at the history as well, is that a great quote that I came across is by an anti-racist campaigner in Britain in the 1980s, Asa Van Andan, and he made a great statement to counter the idea, or to challenge the racism was directed towards people from the former British Empire arriving in Britain from India, Pakistan, and so on, the Caribbean. And he said, "We are here because you were there." And that is the same in Ireland. Ireland was Britain's oldest colony. And all that process of underdevelopment, of stymieing development, of just using the country as a source of natural resources, or food and all that sort of stuff, is as true of Ireland as it is about the Caribbean, about the Indian subcontinent, about what they did to Africa, and all those sorts of things. And what did this mean? All that whole process, I don't have time to go into it a lot, but what this meant for somewhere like Gweedore, where my people are from, is a really dramatic process of people being forced off the land, and forced into. Gweedore had a very small population up until the 1600s, until there was the plantation of Ulster, in which land was taken off them. All the good land in Donegal, in the east of Donegal, in the Lagan Valley, people were pushed off that and pushed over to the west, to Gweedore. That's where Gweedore's population began to emerge from. And all the way through the story of not just the famine, and dramatic events like that, the process of the whole 1800s is the domination of English landlords, sort of keeping people, destroying communal forms of farming that kept people sustained in very poor land for a long, long time, fencing places off for sheep farming and all that sort of stuff, raising rents to force people off the land, of mass evictions and all that. That was the background to my grandparents coming here, because people just simply couldn't live there. But they also came here against the background of a long-standing campaign against this. The Land League in the west of Donegal was absolutely amazing. They, sort of led by fighting by the priest down in Gweedore. And so then you see that them arriving around the turn of the century arrived with a bitter hatred of landlords, which feeds its way into things like the Glasgow rent strike in 1915. It's part of the influence of these things, and it's, I suppose, just trying to capture some of that stuff. And I'm terrified of going on for too long here, because but just to sort of tell you a little bit of the story of my family as well, and how they're sort of then mixed up with that. There were 6 kids born in the family here in Glasgow. 2 of them died in infancy out of very easily preventable diseases. Now it was very common at the time. It seems as a result of that, they decided to move back, and my great grandfather moved back to Gweedore. They had a small plot of land. They started to build a house, and so on. My great grandmother followed about 3 months later with the 4 surviving children. But when she reached Gweedore, she was walking up the main street in Bunbeg and ran into a neighbour who said he was going to a wake. And the wake was for her husband, who just died suddenly from TB, and so on. So an unusual thing. She was a 26-year-old woman at that time, and very unusual. She sold a plot of land, which was a big thing to do in Gweedore, because it wasn't long before sort of Catholics and the Irish, native Irish, couldn't even own land. But she sold it. We think she was going to try and go to America, and the way to do that is to go to Derry and get the boat. And she arrived in Derry and found the bar was up for sale on Waterloo Street. It was called the Inishowen Bar. All up Waterloo Street, there were all these bars named after townlands and areas in Donegal, because this was where people who walked the whole way from Gweedore or from Inishowen or Dunlow or wherever would come, borrow a bit of money from the public and to pay their fare on the Scotch boat over to Glasgow, and then repay it when they came back after working there for the summer. And she bought the Inishowen Bar, renamed it the Gweedore Bar, and that was the family's bar for all that time. And it was so intimately connected with the Scotch boat that came back and forth three times a week. Yeah, and so there's so much more to say, but so the thing that I'm trying to capture in the book is about sort of the involvement of the Irish there, how they live their lives, the richness of their experience, but also how there's that constant toing and froing, and this is a natural state for human beings to do, to try and improve their lives, to go back home, sort of to find comfort and support when times are tough, and so on. And it's exactly the same for migration today. And so I'm just hoping that the book will be an opportunity to try and capture some of those stories and encourage other people to tell their stories as an ongoing process, but also contribute to that side of things that's about welcoming migrants here and being on the side of that and challenging those myths. And sorry for going on for so long, but I'll leave that there.
I'm just listening to the last speaker, Colm, talking about the book there and this constant movement. I think one of the things that I kind of in the work that I've been doing, it's all been focused on the famine as this huge cataclysmic event that occurred, and it was a huge spike and trigger for people moving, and that in a way sets in motion a train of events, because then when bad times happen subsequently in Ireland, where do you go? You go where your family is, or you've got connections that can get you started. So in a way that kind of created there's 32 counties in Ireland, but if you come to Glasgow, it's like and the south side of Glasgow in particular, it's, why is it called Little Donegal? It's just this kind of nucleus obviously got built and expanded. But I mean, you're obviously from that part of the country, but I think that another thing that we tend to not appreciate as much in Glasgow is just the volume of people that came over in subsequent waves in the 20th century. Yeah, just like in the 50s and 60s. And I remember when I was travelling around Ireland, I went through Mayo and in the main street in Castleford, they had this big kind of statue thing, and it was, to me, I walked up there and I was surprised, as it was a kind of commemorating the massive number of people that left in the 1950s to go and live in Scotland. Yeah, they just gutted the town. So I was just wondering if you could say anything a little bit about what's happened in more recent times in terms of waves of people coming here and things that have triggered it.
I mean, I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? There's things that are pushing people, and there's also things that are pulling people, the prospect of employment and all that sort of stuff. But I mean, one area that I'm looking at, for example, just after partition in the 1920s, there was a huge increase in the number of people migrating to Glasgow, and that's because areas like Donegal and the other border counties as well, Monaghan and so on, were cut off from the natural hinterland, and so the development of Donegal went backwards. During that period, it was very difficult to do any trade into. So sort of work dried up, and Donegal's still suffering from that. from that, you know, the decline of the railways, all those sorts of things. So those would be the kind of things that are happening in the 1950s in southern rural Ireland. Were very, very difficult times. Do you know what I mean? And people could find a way in which they could get away. Do you know? And strangely enough, and it's a lovely thing that it's something that I always raised when you know people are talking about borders and all that sort of stuff. They kept a common travel area after the Free State was set up. So it was an open border. There was no, do you know what I mean? There was no restrictions on people coming or going. Do you know what I mean? That's, you know, I think we should just have open borders now these days as well. Do you know, like why can't you have it? That we've been living with it for the last 300 years with Ireland and Britain. So why can't we have it for everywhere else as well? So it's those sorts of thoughts. I'm not saying I'm an expert in every area, but those are the sorts of things that are happening, I think.
There's Paul.
I haven't had a real look round your exhibition, but just what I've seen is absolutely brilliant, Frank. And I noticed in the other room the kind of display case, just the Clonakilty kind of jumped out at me because I've been there. And when you were saying that you went from the north of Ireland down, or like the west coast of Donegal down to the south, did you go through places like Clonakilty? And all those images in that case, where did they come from?
So the thing about the famine was what Paul was referring to is there's a series of illustrations under a kind of glass tabletop in the next room there. During the famine, nobody photographed the famine, right? It was, you know, although photography existed, nobody photographed the poor. You know, the pictures or the images that you see through there are illustrations that were done for the Illustrated London News, which was a high circulation paper at the time. They sent over a guy to make some drawings called John Mahoney, who happened to be Irish, and so he ended up making some images that were kind of done in a sympathetic way, not kind of trying to depicting some of the horrors of it, if you will, without actually being grotesque. Yeah. At the same time, there were other illustrated press like Punch that were just basically portraying the Irish in a very racist way. So that's the story behind those images. I got permission to reproduce them and print them off for the exhibition. To give a bit of context where, you know, I've made all contemporary images that sets it in some historical event. And basically on the where did I go, I went through, I kind of stuck to the coast pretty much, and went out to the islands. That's why I was asking about, like, you know, the 1950s and stuff like that. Like, it's like every time somebody I would go to places like Arranmore Island, Achill Island and Mayo, and every time they heard a Scottish accent, the conversation was about picking potatoes in Ayrshire. You know, and because gangs of people used to be put together, and young people mainly would come over and spend their summers in the west of Scotland. So yeah, that was the crack. Everywhere I went, the accent, it's like that was a conversation quite often.
I'm curious, a couple of people use the term blow-in. I'm curious kind of like what that means in relation, blow-in? A blow-in, you know? I'm curious like what your take is on that in relation to this movement between Scotland and Ireland.
You know, it's funny, I think the whole blow-in thing has... I think the whole blow-in thing's changed a wee bit, certainly. Around Inishowen, around Donegal, the community is so... Like, part of the thing about Anthony Haughey's Anthem project was to say Ireland is not what it was 100 years ago. Ireland, like, the changes in Ireland in the 22 years I've been there, it's just staggering. Like, it's such a progressive country considering what it was and how hidebound it was by the Catholic Church. It's not that place anymore. Like Buncrana itself is full of people from all over the world, very much embraced by the community. It's unbelievably tolerant, considering it's like a wee parochial place. It's so tolerant. I had a gay pride march a few months back. Everybody, including wee blokes in the pub with their flat caps, waving out the door, going, "Good on you." Like, you would never have imagined that of rural Donegal. So, yeah, so the whole blow-in thing. But what's quite funny, actually, is when we moved over there, and my husband wasn't from there at all, but it's like, they can't accept that you're not from there, so it's like, and everybody's got a nickname, right? So, you're one of the flies, aren't you? They're the McDades. No, I'm nothing to do with them. No, I'm only here because... No, you're definitely... I can tell. Look at you, you're a McDade. So even when they don't want you to be a blow-in, they want to go, "I know who your father is." So when the traditional thing is, when you go to Donegal, is they have to kind of know all the family connections. Like that whole familial thing is so important, is to know how to locate you and your value in the world. Is they don't give a shit whether you've, run the Gallery of Modern Art for a decade. You start from the ground up, and it's who is your father, who's your family, who's your kin. Like, who your kin is really matters. But now it's become more all-embracing, and it's lovely, actually, isn't it? To see the changes is really lovely. Yeah. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, the thing about blow-in, I mean, it's sort of harking back to the old days in some ways, because it would be a kind of, if you were new to the area, you'd be half expecting people to say, "Well, what right do you have to have an opinion? You're just a blow-in. You haven't been here and haven't lived through what we've lived through." Do you know what I mean? It was that sort of, and it's a sort of, I suppose people say it in a self-deprecating way now. It's not used that way. You're absolutely right about how much things have changed. It's really staggering to see. I was just on a beach last year with a load of Syrian refugees who had come and settled, and who we all went and had a big party on the beach. It was great. I'm really sorry. I'm going to have to go. I've got to get a plane to London this evening because I'm at a conference at the weekend. Thanks very much for having us. Thanks very much for the invite. And if anybody's interested in being involved in the project, maybe just have a chat to Paula afterwards, and sort of leave your details, and sort of we'll be setting up those sorts of networks and keeping in touch and letting you know when there's a meeting next week. Is it 20th?
Yeah. So the first is an Irish history group that's kind of come out of this project. Yeah. We've had one meeting so far. So if you just email archive@govanhillbass.com, I can add you to the list. The meeting's next Thursday, 20th of October at 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock with Deep End, 21 Misdale Street. And those details are on our website. So if you just go on to the Govanhill Bass Community Trust website, go into the archive project, and you'll see Little Donegal, and it'll give you all the details there.
Thanks very much. Just go.
Sorry, this is a very ill-formed question, and it's a bit of more of a general comment, thought, query around migration. So I'm probably a migrant. I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I came to Aberdeen to study, and I've lived there ever since. And so part of the situation in Aberdeen is as people are aware, there's many people from different countries. My neighbour and good friend next door is from Australia, her husband's German. And so we got talking about how you reach a point in your own life where you're reflecting on it and you're thinking, I'm not Scottish, but then when you go to Ireland, I'm not Irish. And my Australian friend says the same. She's desperate to go back, but she knows when she goes back, she might not feel the same way about it. And it was just reflecting back to something that you said, Frank, at the start about why you start looking into these things. And is it intricately linked with your own sense of place and identity, and just trying to figure out where you fit in? I don't. Do you get what I'm at?
I'm sure maybe you guys have something to say about that as well. But for me, I think there's different levels to it, right? I think that we live in a world today where there's more people moving country than ever before in history. There's over 200 million people, according to the UN, who live in countries today where they weren't born. That's how many people are shifting. And dare I say it, it's because it's changing the subject, but I think a lot now about climate change and what that's going to bring, and it's already started. When a third of Pakistan is underwater, people are on the move, and it's a trend that's going to keep going. So that kind of starts me asking questions in my mind about how are people going to respond when mass migration increases through time as a result of the trends that are already in play in terms of the climate. So there's all that high level context to it, and then you kind of, it comes down to the personal level, and that's when you start to say, oh, hang on a minute, who am I, where am I from, and personalising it. So when I went to Ireland and was travelling around Donegal, I was asking lots of big questions about history and all the rest of it, but standing in the field with a ruined farmhouse where your own ancestors have tilled the soil 3 generations ago, that physical connection really adds a kind of depth to your sense of identity, I guess, and place, And I'm happy to be Scottish, I kind of grew up here, and it's not a kind of yearning for something different. It's just being able to find your place in the world, really, in a never-changing world at that. Yeah. I don't know if you wanted to say anything, Moira, or yeah.
Well, I suppose I would just say that I think it was very interesting for me to come back to Glasgow, because I hadn't actually spent much time in Glasgow really for many years, and so it was really interesting to sort of rediscover it, as my sense of place. And I think when I sort of had most of my life, I've actually, was born in Glasgow, most of my life spent in Northern Ireland, and then I've also got this very strong Donegal connection and back and forward, and in a sort of a way I think I've just come to the conclusion that, it's all part of me and all part of my sense of home. And and I think that, as Frank said, I think that's what's become very common for lots of people now, that sense that you don't have necessarily a fixed sense of what home is, really, and it's sort of multiple sort of sense of communities and place,
I mean, I think the Irish, even the Irish Tourist Board and Donegal County Council market this idea of the Irish diaspora, because that is a big thing. It's the idea of feeling that your identity is Irish, although there's that thing about the physicality about being there, there's still an acknowledgement that the Irish exist all over the world, and they've always been exiting Ireland, and they still do. But there's this sense that they connect, and it's, we're in this kind of more, people connect more virtually now anyway, but it's a big part of the kind of the tourist development in Donegal is to key in with the Irish diaspora. So that whole thing about identity, you don't need to be there, I think there's something about that, but maybe it's something that's specifically Irish because of the history of Ireland, that people have always gone away. They just always have. Sometimes they come back, sometimes they never come back, but it's like they're always connected to the place. Do you not think there is something? Yeah.
I think what's important to acknowledge is that Ireland is special, right? Yeah. I don't mean that it's the best in the world. Ireland's the only country in Europe where the population today is less than it was 200 years ago, and that is unique about Ireland, because the famine was so traumatic and then had this aftermath that decimated the economy, and there's many aspects to it, but it's unique in the sense that the population of Ireland before the famine was over 8 million. Today the population of the whole island of Ireland, including the north, is 7 million. you know, any other country in Europe, the population will be a multiple of what it was over 200 years ago. So,
even to talk like specifics about that, like and during the period of the Celtic Tiger, like the people were loads and hundreds of people were going back there. Like during the period when your mum and dad went back, and when I went over to stay there, so it was a huge influx. And then the recession hit Ireland more than it hit most countries in Europe. And then, like, I was involved in social photography, so I was really aware of it, that these young couples would get married, then the guy would be off to Australia. Like, a whole generation disappeared into it. Like Louise, who's sitting here, can speak about that, because, like, your generation, they just vacated Ireland.
As soon as I finished college, it was 2008.
Yeah.
And we went back to Ballerina, where I'm from, and just the whole town left.
Yeah.
Pretty much. I went to America for a little while and then came back to Galway, and like a lot of Donegal people settled in Galway, and then we got priced out pretty much, and there just weren't apartments, so we left to Europe, and then eventually wanted to come home, and then still couldn't find a house, so moved to Glasgow. So this is kind of like the closest thing to home than Galway.
No, it's interesting. It's like, it's as if it's in the kind of psyche that when things get tough, you bugger off out the country, and it's always seems to have happened, isn't it? Yeah. Anyway.
yeah.
I'm in the uncomfortable position of last orders, so we're going to vacate the building shortly, and I'm conscious that some of you may want to have a quick look at the exhibition before you come back and spend a lot more time on it, because there's many layers to this one. It's very rich, multi-layered exhibition. You've got to spend some time with. So this panel is really just kind of touching the surface of things, right? So look out for Moira's exhibition in due course, whenever that might be, when we can get a slot for it, a slot and a plot, once we see the work, and we'll be making an announcement later next year for an exchange residency again in the Parkline Group, and someone from Ireland will come over here and vice versa. So it's something we're going to continue, that dialogue will continue. Now, next week will be another panel session, same time, same place. Deirdre Robb, Director of Belfast Exposed, will be here alongside Trish Lamb, who's the Director of Photo Museum Ireland, which has just changed its name from Gallery Photography in Dublin. So they'll be kind of looking at, aspects of Irish identity and its relationship to Britishness, and very, very interesting. And what else? There was something else I was going to say, but I can't quite remember what it is now. But, Glasgow University, they have an exhibition on there at the moment, on the East Quad outside, at the back of the old university. South African artist and visual activist Zanele Maholi. There's some large-scale outdoor displays of their work, which is also portraits. That's a collaboration with Belfast Photo Festival and the Museum. So there's lots of connections everywhere, but do get to see that. It's on until the 6th of November. Frank's show is on until the 30th, so that's not that far away. I really do encourage you to come back. So thanks everyone for coming again. Great audience. Thank you. Thank you.